Hello learners, and welcome to our final video of chapter 11 part 2, which is all about action potentials. So we finally made it to the axon here. And yes, we do have the axon terminal, but remember the goal is for the action potential to go down and then open those calcium voltage gated channels so that we can create a synapse with a post synaptic neuron, just like we saw with graded potentials. But our focus is going to be action potentials before that synapse even happens, okay? So, of course, we got to kind of get an idea of how we're going to organize ourselves and also the sequence of an action potential, just like we saw the sequence of a graded potential. Now, of course, everything is about how the membrane changes, and that's extremely important with action potentials. Because remember, it's going to be all about how the membrane changes in relation to voltage-gated channels. And the two voltage-gated channels we're going to have is going to be the potassium voltage-gated channel, we put VG, and also the sodium voltage-gated channel. As you can see, when the neuron is at rest, sort of this purple area, so this purple area here and this purple area here is going to be when the neuron is at rest. That means we're dealing with negative 70 millivolts here. We see that the voltage-gated and potassium and sodium channels are both closed. So you see it closed here. Over here, you also see it closed and closed. That means when you're dealing with the action potential, you're going to start at rest, and then you're going to end at rest. Well, what happens here? If we can reach that negative 55 millivolt threshold, then that means we actually can have an action potential. So what's going to happen? First is going to be depolarization. Depolarization, that just means that you have an influx of sodium ions. So let's go ahead and start off with our resting potential here. Then we're going to hit our threshold. You see that negative 55. And then we're going to go and have an influx of sodium. Now, if we're going to have an influx of sodium, that means that our voltage-gated sodium channels will be open here. So therefore, sodium is going to go into the actual membrane, and that's going to allow a huge depolarization up to around plus 30 millivolts. So you see how we had our negative 55 threshold, and then we also are going to have it reach that plus 30 millivolts. So the neuron is going to reach negative 55 millivolts, and then it's going to depolarize, and sodium is going to come in to the membrane until it reaches plus 30 millivolts. Now, what ends up happening is that this plus 30 millivolts is very important. You see that we kind of have this here. We're going straight from our depolarization, and then we're going to be going into repolarization and hyperpolarization, which is this yellow color, right? But what happens? As we can see, as soon as we start to go into repolarization, this voltage-gated sodium channel is now closed, right? We see it looks like it's closed. And what do we see that's open? It's going to be the voltage-gated potassium channels are open. And so what ends up happening is once you hit that plus 30 millivolts, those voltage-gated sodium channels are going to close, and the voltage-gated potassium channels are going to open, because what's going to happen is there's so much sodium inside of the membrane. Now the potassium is like, it's too much positive energy around me. I have to get out of here. So it's going to want to leave the actual membrane at that point. And when it leaves the membrane, of course, then you're going to end up losing positive charge. So all the influx of sodium, positive charge that we have here, when we have K plus or potassium leaving the membrane, once you hit that plus 30 millivolts, now we're going to lose positive charge. And if you lose positive charge, what's going to happen to the membrane potential? It's going to return to rest or repolarize. We're going to have that repolarization, repolarization, repolarization until you get back down to rest. Okay? Now here's the interesting part. As soon as you hit around negative 50, so let's say we have negative 50 right here. Let's do another little dot. As soon as you hit around negative 50, these voltage-gated potassium channels start closing. Now, they're not 100% closed, but they start closing. Put VG, K plus, start closing at negative 50 millivolts. Of course, that's an estimate range, right? So because these voltage-gated potassium gates are going to be closing, you still are going to have some potassium that's spilling out. And the closing happens really slowly, and so does the opening also happens really slowly as well. So what's going to happen is, if we just continue on, we're going to have repolarization because, again, potassium is leaving through its voltage-gated channel once we hit that plus 30. And then guess what? We're going to be back at rest but we're also going to overshoot that negative. Why are we going to overshoot that negative? Because the voltage-gated potassium channels are not fully closed. They're closing. So as some potassium still leave and leave and leave the cell, then guess what? It will get more and more negative, even past negative 70. It could get down to like negative 85 or like negative 90, which we're used to seeing. Now, what's going to happen after that? Right now, you're like, okay, finally, over time, that voltage-gated potassium channel is going to fully close. But how do we get the actual membrane potential back to rest, that negative 70? Well, we have our good old sodium-potassium pump. That sodium-potassium pump is going to get us back to rest. Because remember, it helps maintain the membrane potential. So even after all these changes, it's like, okay, let me make sure I'm going to kick out a certain amount of sodium and add a certain amount of potassium back in so that we can get back to rest. And that is the entire, sequence of the action potential. So first we're at rest, negative 70. Then you're going to have the voltage-gated sodium channels open and call the depolarization up to plus 30. But before that happens, the neuron has to reach the negative 55 millivolt, threshold. When that happens, when you hit the plus 30 here, then the voltage-gated potassium channels are going to open, and you're going to have a loss of positive charge, which makes the membrane potential more negative. Now, it takes a while for these voltage-gated potassium channels to close. So while they're closing, you will overshoot, and you end up going way more negative than what our resting membrane potential is until those voltage-gated channels fully close. So anytime you see this, just say, you can always say closing instead of closed. Okay? And then finally, our sodium-potassium pump comes in to get us back at rest, which is negative 70 millivolts. Let's go ahead and get a worksheet example of this, just so we can see another version of us writing down information down on our on a graph itself. All right. Below is a graph depicting change in membrane potential during an action potential. Within this graph, write the state of voltage-gated sodium and potassium channels during each main phase of action potential. So before, you might want to just kind of label that terminology. You might want to say, okay, this is going to be polarized. You can also say at rest. We know, and when we have a very positive change to our membrane potential, that's going to be depolarized. When we return back to rest, that's going to be repolarization. And of course, when we go beyond the membrane potential, that's going to be hyperpolarization. And in order to get back to that resting membrane potential, we know we're going to have the sodium-potassium pump. So just get the terminology in your head, and then let's visualize from what we just talked about. Okay, so let me get another color. Let me use that. All right, so at rest, are the voltage-gated sodium-potassium channels open or closed? So at rest, we know they're both going to be closed. I'm going to write C for closed, okay? And then what's going to happen? You're going to have that stimulus get to the negative 55 millivolt threshold through the graded potentials at the initial segment. And then once it reaches that threshold, an action potential is started. So we're going to have depolarization. Okay? Depolarization means the membrane potential is getting more positive all the way up until you reach that plus 30 millivolts. And at this point, in order to allow it to be more positive, the voltage-gated sodium channel is open, O for open, but the potassium channel is closed. Okay? Now, at that 30 millivolt, that's going to trigger the now closing of the sodium voltage-gated channel and the opening of the potassium voltage-gated channel. So what's going to happen here is, once you reach that threshold, the sodium voltage-gated channel is going to now close, and the potassium is going to be open. And this makes sense because we see a repolarization back to the resting membrane potential. You're at negative 70 because that potassium is open, potassium is leaving the membrane, right? And if potassium is leaving the membrane, that means you are giving away more of that positive energy to the outside of the cell, making the inside of the cell more negative. Whereas over here, you were influxing a bunch of sodium coming in, making the inside of the cell more positive. Okay? Then what do we say? Well, guess what? The potassium voltage gated channels don't automatically just close like we see with the sodium ones, at least for this example. What happens is it takes a while to fully close. And so what ends up happening is you can go and you will go beyond the -7 resting membrane potential. So sodium channels are still going to be closed, but we say that the potassium channel is closing. Okay? So I have to write out closing. And what was the number that allowed us to realize, hey, this is where the potassium channel is going to start to close. It takes a little bit, so that's why we get an overshot here, but it's going to start to close, starts closing at -50 millivolts. Okay, so just keep that in mind. And because it's closing, some potassium can still leak out, or not leak out. I don't want to be confused for leak channels, but some potassium can then be removed from the inside of the cell to the outside through its voltage gated channel until those potassium voltage gates fully close. Then we're going to have our sodium potassium pump come in and say, okay, let me get this membrane potential back to what it was by bringing in potassium and, of course, kicking out some sodium. And you get back to resting potential. Okay, so that's how you do it. I recommend, again, printing this out or writing your own graph and making sure you can label those things. When we get into more details about action potentials, we're going to add in more details about these voltage-gated channels, specifically for sodium. Okay, so let's move on to the next example, which is going to be number 18. Casey is taking a new medication that blocks potassium channel. What stage of an action potential will be most affected by this drug? Depolarization, reaching threshold, repolarization. So reaching threshold is all about a graded potential getting to -55 millivolts to trigger an action potential, right? So you're not really dealing with any potassium or sodium voltage gated channels yet. So that one's not going to be as effective. Now depolarization or repolarization, those are the last two left. Now depolarization, the membrane is going to be more positive. That's what we know, right? And depolarization has to do with which ion? Sodium. So just by process of elimination, you could say letter C is the correct answer. Well, let's, of course, see why. Okay? Letter C is the repolarization phase. That means you get to your plus 30 millivolts from depolarization. Those sodium voltage gated channels are going to close, and your potassium channels are going to open so that you can repolarize and return to rest. That's what repolarization is about. Now, it takes a while for them to, of course, fully close. So at -50 millivolts, you'll see them slowly closing and closing more, but you can overshoot until you get hyperpolarization. If you take the medication that's going to block potassium channels, that's not going to affect the depolarization phase because they're already closed, but it will affect the repolarization phase because, again, the potassium voltage gate is open at that point. So that would be the correct answer for this one. Let's go back to the actual PowerPoint. Now that we have a general idea of what action potentials are all about, we now have to put in a little bit more effort here. And the effort that we're going to put in is just by understanding more about a voltage-gated channel, and that's going to be the sodium voltage-gated channel. Now, the sodium voltage-gated channel, before I even start this slide here, has 3 different states. It can be opened, it can be closed, or it can be inactivated. Open, closed, or inactivated. And this is going to be important because at first when we saw beforehand, we're like, and in general, when you're talking about action potential, you're saying we have our voltage-gated potassium and sodium, and that was it. But now we got to figure out why action potentials always go in one direction and don't go backwards. And that means we have to learn a little bit more about other voltage-gated channels and how they work when it comes to sodium. So we're just adding another layer. Yes, they're going to open and close like we saw before, but now we also have a state of it being inactivated. So that's the 3 states of a voltage-gated sodium channel. And let's go ahead and think of this as a door. That'll be the easiest way to understand it. So for example, when it's open, the door is open. So the door is going to swing open. Door is open. That's a little bit easier to see. When it's closed, the door is shut. But just because it's shut doesn't mean you can't reopen it again. So it is shut, and it can also be reopened. So sometimes you'll see it be called that it's going to be at rest. Okay? But if it's inactivated, that's a little bit different. This is like saying the door is shut and it has a deadbolt on it. So the door is shut and it has a deadbolt, it doesn't matter what's happening to the membrane or the voltage or membrane potential, that deadbolt is there. And until that membrane is going to repolarize, that's when it can reset back to being closed, where the deadbolt is off. That's the kind of idea behind the 3 states. If you want to say it in technical terms, you'll say, okay, when it's closed, the door is shut. Okay, you're at rest, meaning negative 70 millivolts. But if you hit negative 55 millivolts, the door can open and you can get depolarization. When it's open, that means the sodium is going to be coming in, because we're talking about the sodium voltage gated channel. Sodium can keep coming in and, of course, depolarize the membrane. When it's inactivated, the door is shut with that deadbolt. So that means it's just not going to open anytime it needs. It's only going to open when the membrane is going to repolarize. And if it repolarizes, it can reset to being closed again. And so when you're thinking of the sodium voltage gated channel, then you can also say that means when it's inactivated, there's definitely some kind of separate inactivation gate that's blocking that opening. And so that's what that deadbolt is about. It's like this separate little piece that's kind of blocking the opening, and it's not going to move. That deadbolt's not going to be released until the membrane repolarizes, and then you hyperpolarize and get back to rest. And once it's at rest again, it can be at negative 70 millivolts, and it has the ability to open again. So we got to keep that in mind as we're learning about the refractory period, okay? So what is the refractory period? It takes place during an action potential. And during this time, the cell can either can't respond to the stimulus itself, or it needs a stronger stimulus to get a response. That's what the refractory period is about. And there's 2 phases or 2 parts, and one comes after the other. So the first phase is going to be absolute refractory, and then after that, the relative refractory period happens. After the relative refractory period, then you're going to go to the absolute. And so as you can see, because one comes after the other, the action potential is always going to go in one single direction. And having both of these refractory period ensures that the action potential is in one single direction. We call it unidirectional. And we call it unidirectional propagation. That just means that you are spreading that action potential down the axon, one after the other. So if I had a little axon here, of course with myelin on it, then when you talk about propagation, you are spreading that action potential down the entire length of the axon. Details about these 2 phases or 2 parts of the refractory period is the absolute refractory period. And the definition of this is that no additional action potentials can be evoked. So that means you're only dealing with one action potential at a time, and that allows you to focus on one action potential at a time. Okay? Versus the relative refractory period, you actually don't have to have just one action potential at a time. You can have a second action potential. Okay, you can have a second action potential, but that's only if you have a larger than normal stimulus. And we'll see this when we get to the next piece of this, which is going to be the graph itself. Now, what this means is when you're at the negative 70 millivolts, and then of course you hit the threshold of negative 55 millivolts, your one action potential is going to be able to fire off, right? But of course, when it comes to an action potential, you're going to have a situation where you're going to repolarize, hyperpolarize, and then you're going to get back to rest, correct? But when it comes to the relative refractory period, where this whole hyperpolarization process is happening, if you are starting from the hyperpolarization, not at negative 70, maybe at negative 90, for example, you're going to need way more depolarization that's going to occur in order to hit the threshold and to start another action potential. That's what that means. That's what that larger than normal stimulus means. So for example, if you have a negative 70, you're trying to get to negative 55, then that's a little bit easier because you're like, okay, well, that's only 15 millivolt change that I need. But if I'm going from negative 90 and I'm trying to get to negative 55, that's a 35 millivolt change because we're starting off from hyperpolarization, now trying to get through to that negative 55 threshold, not at rest. So just keep that in mind when you're thinking of relative refractory period, okay? Now I'll just go into details more about absolute refractory, and then I'll go into relative refractory. So there's also going to be some differences when it comes to the ion channels. We already know the different states of a sodium voltage-gated channel. Voltage-gated channels are also going to be called ion channels, okay? Now, how's the absolute refractory period going to start? Just like any other action potential. There's going to be a depolarization because the voltage-gated sodium channels are open. So the door is open, Sodium is going to come in. Okay? And this is only going to end when the sodium channels return to a resting state. In other words, it's going to end when the voltage-gated sodium channels repolarize. So we're not saying that the actual voltage-gated channels are closed. We're saying they're inactivated. The door is shut, it has a deadbolt on it, and then only until we actually get back to rest or closed will that deadbolt come off. Okay? So that's when that's going to end. The voltage-gated sodium channels are going to repolarize so they can return to a resting state. Anytime you see the phrase return to resting state, that means repolarize. Now, how long does this take? Very quick. 0.4 to 2 milliseconds. Very, very fast. And what's the whole function of this? Again, the goal is that we are going to ensure that we have propagation of the actual action potential going in one direction. Another thing is each action potential is a distinct event. That's going to be extremely important to understand. That means nothing's going to interfere. You're not going to have just all these other random action potentials coming in. It's going to be one action potential at a time, right? And the cool thing about this is it also establishes a maximum rate of neuronal firing. What does this mean? An action potential can only go forwards, not backwards, right? So once it hits that trigger zone or initial segment, and then you're going to go straight from threshold down the axon to the terminus. And when you're talking about one action potential at a time, the absolute refractory period establishes the actual time frame for that. What's that time frame? 0.4 to 2 milliseconds. Understand the action potential when it relates to that time frame. Well, think about it. The absolute refractory period is going to establish the period of time the neuron can't fire because we're doing one action potential at a time. So inherently, that allows it to establish how many action potentials can fire in a specific time frame. And one example of that would be saying the number of action potential the neuron can send, and say, I don't know, if we're going from 0.4 to 2 milliseconds, just to say 1 millisecond. So the number of action potential the neuron can send in 1 millisecond is going to equal to the absolute refractory period. Huh? And it is determined by that. Write that down. Determined by the absolute refractory period. So again, it's something that you can just come up with because you have a range of time here. But you say, okay, the number of action potentials the neuron can send in 1 millisecond is going to be determined by the absolute refractory period. So keep that in mind. Next, let's go ahead and look at our relative refractory period. Again, only a larger than normal stimulus can evoke an action potential because we're going from hyperpolarization and we're trying to go to that negative 55 threshold. Now, this is going to begin with the voltage-gated sodium channels in a resting state. What does that mean? Well, we're still dealing with it beginning where the absolute refractory period ended. So the absolute refractory period ended when we repolarized back to the negative 70 millivolts, right? So that's going to be the same thing we see here. So we're going to start at rest in a resting state due to repolarization. That's going to be negative 70 millivolts, okay? Some potassium channels are open. We know that from before. We know that when you're repolarizing, potassium channels are open, and it takes a while for them to close. Once you hit that negative 50 millivolts, it takes a while for them to close, right? So what's going to happen is some of them are still open. And so, yes, you're going to have repolarization and hyperpolarization. And then once we go through that process and the sodium channels completely close, then the sodium-potassium pump can come in and help us get back to negative 70 millivolts. And so the relative refractory period is going to end when resting potential is reestablished. I need us to realize that resting state and resting potential are two different things here. Resting state is when repolarization ends. And of course, when you're talking about repolarization, you are returning to negative 70 millivolts. But when they're talking about the resting potential, that's at the beginning and the complete end, getting back to our overall negative 70 millivolts and no random changes. So with repolarization, yes, you're at negative 70, but it's then going to hyperpolarize, right? Whereas when you're at a closed sodium potassium voltage gated channels, when they're completely closed, then we know that we are dealing with reestablishing our resting membrane potential of negative 70 millivolts. So just keep that in mind. Because yes, repolarization means you're going to go through negative 70 millivolts, but then because the potassium channels are still open, you're going to end up overshooting that. And you're going to have hyperpolarization. So just make sure we understand that. Anytime you're seeing sodium channels return to a resting state, you're talking about something that's inactivated. And of course, with inactivated sodium voltage gates, they're going to repolarize until they reset to closed. And closed means that, yes, the door is shut, but it's at rest. That means it has the ability to be depolarized into open once it hits the negative 55 millivolts. Let's see a brand new graph in relation to absolute refractory and relative refractory. So first, we see that this is going to be absolute refractory. And remember, this is going to be a period where the cell cannot respond to a stimulus. That's the absolute refractory. And where it can respond to a stimulus, but that stimulus has to be really, really great and strong, that's going to be the relative refractory period. Okay, so just keep those little details in mind. Now, what is the absolute refractory period? We know it's going to start when the voltage gated sodium channels are open. Okay, and we also know that is going to end when the sodium voltage gated channels are inactivated or returning to a resting state. So that's why you have the boundaries here for those two. Let me get it better. You have the boundaries for those two there. Now, the absolute refractory period ends, and then, of course, you start the relative refractory period. The relative refractory period is going to begin when, again, those sodium voltage-gated channels are inactivated or in a resting state, and some of our potassium channels are still open. As you can see, that's where that repolarization is. And then we're going to have hyperpolarization up until those potassium channels are going to fully close and you don't get the hyperpolarization anymore, so that the sodium potassium pump can come in and help us get back to our normal resting membrane potential, or again, our voltage gated channels are closed. Now this looks very different from the graph we saw before. So let me go back to the graph we saw before, or just a boundary of 1, 2, 3, 4. It's all about open, close, open, close. Now this one looks a little bit different because again, we have those sodium voltage gated sodium channels that are now going to be open, closed, or inactivated. So here we can see that our potassium and our sodium are going to be closed. So closed and closed, okay? And then here we see, it does seem like the colors are backwards versus the graph we saw previously. So this is going to be the purple is going to be sodium. And the potassium looks like it's going to be pink here. So, of course, for the absolute refractory period, this is very short. So it's going to be 0.4 to 2 milliseconds, whereas the relative refractory period is going to be a little bit longer, so 5 to 15. Let me make sure I'll go back and write 5 to 15 here. Apologies. And I'll just talk about the rest of these as I'm going through, okay? So we see that the absolute refractory period is going to start when the sodium channels are open. So sodium is going to come through. And of course, you're going to have depolarization. And it's going to end when repolarization starts. So what's going to happen is the sodium voltage-gated channels are going to be resting or inactivated. And then the potassium channels are going to be open. So potassium is going to be coming out. And you're going to get repolarization back to negative 70 millivolts. But we know this is not at rest. We know that the channels are not fully closed because this is just repolarization. So as soon as we get to that repolarization, we get to that negative 70 millivolts, we know that the relative refractory period is going to start. Now, also never forget that negative 50 millivolt. That's going to be the signal to say, hey, these potassium channels are going to start closing. But it's going to take a while for them to fully close. So we are going to have hyperpolarization. And then when they close, we'll see an increase in the membrane potential, but we need the sodium potassium pump to get us back to that resting state. So of course you can put here, potassium is closing, sodium is again inactivated, and then they're both back closed here. Once the sodium potassium pump gets us back to that negative 70 millivolts where we're going to stay. Now, what's the difference between the relative refractory period it's going to have a longer amount of time that we're in the relative refractory period. Why? Because your axon wants to rest. It wants to rest from having to fire too much. If you have to fire over and over and over again and you never rest, that's not going to make it healthy. So to keep it healthy, it's going to be important that it does have the ability to rest. Okay. And again, if I'm starting from below that -70 threshold and I need to make sure I get up to -55, I'm going to need a stronger stimulus to again start another action potential. Okay. Now let's go over here and see some more functions of the relative refractory period. Prevent overexcitation. Remember I told you they take a longer time and this is going to allow the neuron to rest. Well, that's going to prevent the overexcitation. And also, again, it's still going to ensure that you have a unidirectional propagation, because what's going to happen is you have to go through the absolute refractory period, which is very quick, and then you go through the relative refractory period, which allows your neuron to rest. And then if you have a large enough stimulus, you can go back to the absolute refractory period, and the system goes on and on and on. And so what that means is, once you end the relative refractory period, you're going to need a good enough stimulus to open the sodium voltage gates to be able to have another depolarization to that plus 30 millivolts. And that's what's really cool about the refractory period. So let's go ahead and get into a worksheet question related to this information. All right, let's go with number 21. What factor determines the maximum frequency of action potentials? When you talk about maximum frequency, you're asking how many action potentials you can have. That could be propagated by an axon. Okay. So we're talking about factors that determine how many action potentials you can have. That means we're definitely thinking about the refractory period. There's two phases, absolute and relative. And there was only one phase that focused on giving the number of action potentials you can have within a certain amount of time. And that was the absolute refractory period. Okay? And what do we say about this? The number of neurons is basically the number of neurons that can be sent in a certain amount of time. That's going to be determined by the absolute refractory period. Okay? Now, when you're thinking about this, you can even write the number of action potentials. I don't know why this is so ugly looking. Sorry. The number of action potentials that can fire in a certain time. When we had a range, which is 0.4 to 2 milliseconds, and you can choose anything in that range. Of course, we chose 1. Let's see how we can relate that to some math to tell us the actual maximum frequency of action potentials you can get. So, for example, if we say that the absolute refractory period is going to be 0.01 seconds, and that means that in 0.01 seconds, you get 1 action potential, we can use that to figure out the number of action potentials in 1 single second. So what do? Well, if we have 1 action potential in 1 second, because these are related to one another, we could say that 1 action potential divided by 0.01 seconds will give us action potential per second. So what we do is we divide 1 divided by 0.001, and we get 100 action potentials per second. So that's one way we can answer this. You don't even have to give a specific number because it just says explain why. So you also can say, well, the absolute refractory period is going to set the limit when an action potential can fire. Therefore, that's going to set the limit on how many can fire within a certain time range. Me, I like to give an example and then still giving you the same explanation. All right, folks, let's move back to the PowerPoint. We made it to our last piece of this video and also about action potentials, which is how do they move down the axon, okay? And that's going to be through propagation. Now, we know that it definitely is going to be unidirectional. It doesn't go backwards. It only goes forward due to the absolute refractory period happening before the relative refractory period, right? And also, we need to understand that sometimes you may think that the action potential is just one single event. Really, it's a series of events that happen as you move down the axon. So here we have some light bulbs. You have 4 light bulbs, and you also have some myelin, the myelin sheath on this axon. And say all these light bulbs are off. When you turn them on, it's going to look like they're all turning on at the same time. But really, this one's turning on, then this one, then this one, then this one. But because they look like they're turning on all at the same time, That's the reason why people can sometimes think that action potentials are just one event. Whereas just like these light bulbs, they're coming on one at a time, but it's so fast it looks like one, right? It looks like they're all coming on at once. So just keep that in mind. Now again, propagation is going to be the unidirectional spread of an action potential down the plasma membrane or the axon. And there's two types of propagation. There's going to be continuous conduction, and there's also going to be saltatory. And we're going to talk about saltatory next. First, we're going to focus on the continuous conduction. Okay? And of course, when we're thinking of conduction, we're talking about conduction electricity because these are electrical signals. But most of the time now, we just say propagation. Just keep that in mind. Let's orient ourselves to understand continuous conduction. First, we have the axon here. Of course, the axon has its membrane. And then as you can see, we have our sodium channels. So our voltage gated sodium channels. We have our axon. That's the whole yellow going through here. And as you can see, inside the axon is negatively charged. Outside of the membrane or the axon is going to be positively charged. Again, what we normally see. Okay? Erase that. What else do we see? We see that this particular membrane or these axons are not covered with myelin sheaths. They're not covered with any myelin sheaths. So if they're not covered with myelin sheaths, that can be one way you can think of continuous. Continuous has no myelin sheath. These are going to be axons that are out here riding dirty. Okay? And because they have no myelin sheath and no extra covering, then guess what? They are very slow. So this is going to be slow propagation along an unmyelinated axon. Let's continue to orient ourselves. So we got our axon, we got our voltage-gated sodium channels, and we also see that these voltage-gated sodium channels are open. So that means you're going to have sodium that's going to come into the cell because, again, it has a negative charge on the inside. And if sodium's rushing into the cell, that is depolarizing. Okay? Then we also have some of those same sodium voltage gates that are completely closed. And so if they're completely closed, we know they're going to be resting membrane potentials. Okay? I mean, back to that -7. So let's go ahead and figure out how this is going to work, especially when you talk about continuous conduction. Well, what's going to happen is you're going to have the depolarization. So you're going to have a flood of sodium come in. And then that sodium is going to move towards the second. So this is our first, this is our second, this is our third. The second voltage gate here. And once it hits that second voltage gate, then again, you're going to have that second voltage gate here open up. Sodium's going to come in. And then, of course, it's going to go down to the third voltage gate, where, again, sodium's going to come in. So you have those three depolarization events that are happening as you hit each of the voltage, sodium voltage gates along this axon. Okay? So what do we see here? One, we see three different action potentials, but most importantly, only a piece of that axon is depolarizing. So it's this piece first, then this piece, then this piece. Right? They're all depolarizing at the same time. So you're only depolarizing segments of that axon. Also, they do not go backwards because we're going from absolute period, refractory period to relative refractory period. Another thing to add is that some things that we don't see that we want to always keep in mind, let me put the red here, is that we do have leak channels. Okay? So if you have an influx of a lot of sodium through the leak channels, some of them are going to come out because high concentration goes to low concentration, just plain old diffusion. Right? So you have those sodium leak channels as well. What does that mean? If some sodium can leak out, it's going to take a longer time to get down to that next gate, right? That next voltage gate to trigger that action potential. We're not saying all of it's going to be gone, but yeah, it's going to take a long time if you're still trying to have more and more sodium come in, but then more of it's coming out at the same time. Another visual for continuous conduction is that if you had a knight and he had to send a message to a castle, he would have to go up and down, up and down, up and down these mountains. And that's going to take a longer time. It's going to take a lot of energy to be able to get to the castle and send the message. So that's one little option you can have as far as a visual. Now let's get into saltatory conduction. Saltatory means to leak. And the beauty of these is that you're going to have myelin. Okay? So we have our same axons here. We have our same sodium voltage gated channels here. We're depolarizing in one. We're at rest. And also, what do we notice? We see myelin. So we have myelin here and myelin here, wrapping around that axon. So we have the 3 gates and we have the 2 myelin. Let's see how the active potentials work now. So first, you're going to have depolarization. Of course, sodiums are going to come into the cell. But guess what? The myelin does not have leak channels. And what's the beauty of that? No leak channels, you can zoom through to the next gate. Before, with continuous conduction, we had to basically deal with the leak channels leaking out some of the sodium, and therefore it could take a long time to get to that second gate and trigger a second action potential, etc., etc. Okay? So the myelin equals no leak channels. So yes, you're going to have the sodium, then it's going to zoom through to the next gate, and then what's going to happen at this gate? A second action potential. But guess what? Every gate that we see here, 1, 2, and 3, are not just called our sodium voltage gates anymore. These are going to be called nodes. Because you have the myelin coming here, and then there's a node. Then you have another myelin, then there's more nodes. Another myelin, then there's more nodes. And these are called the nodes of Ranvier. Okay? And so the only time that you're actually going to have depolarization is at those nodes. And instead of having to go through and take so much time to go through each axon and deal with leak channels, you can actually leap from node to node now. Because the sodium is just going to zoom through. It'll be at this node, another depolarization, zoom through. It's at this node, another depolarization if you had another myelin and the next nodes as well. So that's the beauty of this continuous conduction. This makes sense because remember, if you want to send a signal all the way down your leg, you want to make sure you have a good enough of myelin. A lot of times when myelin is broken down in some kind of way, or your nerves are not, myelin's not surrounding it, then you can see that the signal is not going to travel as far, and you might not even get a signal to your leg, and you might not even have feeling in your foot, for example, if you have any issues with your myelin. This is the same setup as we saw before. We see a negative axon inside the cell or inside the axon, and we see a positive on the outside. Okay? And then when you have an influx of sodium, of course, this is going to be more positive, but there are no leak channels. So all that positive is going to go straight to the next node, which has the voltage-gated sodium channels, causing depolarization again. It stays positive, causing depolarization again, and that can happen very, very fast. All right, let's go ahead and go back to sending the message to the castle. Now we're sending the message to the castle, but guess what? This time, there's going to be watchtowers. So here's this knight coming through saying, hey, I got a message for the castle. The only energy you have to put in is just go up to this watchtower. Then that watchtower is going to tell this watchtower is going to tell that one, and then the message is going to fast in a quicker way and more faster is going to get to the castle and send the message. Just like when you have axons that's wrapped in myelin, you get the message to whatever part of the body you need to faster than if they do not have myelin. All right, let's get into our last worksheet example. And I'm going to do number 25. Dr. Roberts is testing a new drug that blocks sodium channels in the axons of a neuron. So it blocks sodium channels. Is that extremely important? Yes. Because without those sodium channels, what can't happen? Depolarization. Without depolarization, you're not moving that signal down the axon. Okay? Which of the following statements is correct? Now, first things first, when you're looking at this, you see greater potentials, active potentials. You also see something about potassium channels. You want to make sure you're focusing on what is necessary. When we're talking about sodium channels in the axons of a neuron, we're only talking about action potentials. So I don't even care what this says. I'm getting rid of it because it has greater potentials here. Both the generation, greater potential, yada yada. Letter B, I'm out because, again, it says greater potentials. It has nothing to do with greater potential. Now we're down to C and D. The drug will prevent the propagation of action potentials. True or false? We want to figure out the one that is going to be the true statement. Is this true? Blocking the sodium channels will not be allowing the propagation of action potentials. I mean, spreading that signal down the axon. making sure you have those sodium channels, voltage gated channels that are open, so we have a depolarizing event. And if you have myelin, it can jump from node to node. Is that true? Yes, this is true. So automatically you say this is the correct answer. Let's go down to letter D though. The drug would only have a mild effect on the neuron because potassium channels are still operational. Now, yes, we know potassium channels are important, right? We also know potassium leak channels are important. Great. They didn't really tell us if this is myelinated or not. But potassium is important for a lot of other bodily functions, but when it comes to action potential, we know that in order to even start action potential or to trigger it, you have to get to that negative 55 millivolt threshold, and then you're going to depolarize to plus 30 before potassium channels even open. Potassium channels don't even open until you're doing repolarization, right? So when it says, oh, we have potassium channels, it doesn't matter, that's not true because we need sodium channels first to open before we can have our potassium channels open once we depolarize to plus 30 millivolts. Okay, folks? Yes, this is a long video, but I like to take my time when it comes to action potentials because a lot is going on. So hopefully this helps you. See you in the next chapter.